Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story, I'd really appreciate it if you could use your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review also helps out so much. And if you want, comment what time it is for you and where in the world you're listening from. We love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And of course, if you're enjoying the content, please consider subscribing. Now, let's get into tonight's story. The discovery began with something so small that most people would have dismissed it entirely. Noah Klein sat in his cubicle on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Seattle, staring at a screen filled with error logs that nobody else wanted to review. His job title was Back-End Systems Auditor, which was a polite way of saying he spent 40 hours a week reading through the digital garbage that enterprise software produced when something went slightly wrong, but not wrong enough for anyone to care. He had been doing this work for 6 years. He was good at it because he had the kind of mind that found patterns in chaos, the kind of brain that could spot the single discordant note in an orchestra of data. Most people found his work unbearably tedious. Noah found it calming. Numbers didn't lie. Systems didn't have hidden agendas. Code did exactly what it was told, even when what it was told was stupid. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, Noah was contracted to review archived error logs for a global cloud storage provider called Cirrus Systems. The company stored data for hospitals, banks, universities, telecommunications companies, and millions of individual users across 6 continents. Their infrastructure was enormous, redundant, and theoretically fail-safe, which meant, of course, that it failed constantly in small, invisible ways that Noah was paid to catalogue and explain. He had been scrolling through timestamp errors for the better part of an hour when he noticed something unusual. A cluster of identical errors, all occurring within the same 1-second window. That alone wasn't remarkable. Coordinated failures happened, but these errors weren't coordinated. They appeared across systems that had absolutely nothing to do with each other. Financial servers in London, weather satellites feeding data to stations in Tokyo, hospital databases in Mumbai, telecommunications networks in Sao Paulo, all recording the exact same micro-timing drift at the exact same moment. Noah leaned closer to his screen. The timestamp drift was minuscule, measured in milliseconds, but it was identical across all systems, down to the 10th decimal place. These systems did not share clocks. They did not synchronize globally. They operated on entirely different networks, different continents, different security protocols. There was no technical reason they should experience the same timing error at the same instant. Noah opened a new terminal, window, and started pulling data. He expanded his search parameters, querying not just Cirrus Systems, but every client database he had access to through his contract clearances. The search took 11 minutes to compile results. When the data populated, Noah felt something shift in his chest. A small, cold weight settling into place. The anomaly wasn't limited to Cirrus Systems, it was everywhere. Across every major infrastructure network he could access, the same timestamp drift appeared. Power grids, air traffic control systems, stock exchanges, university research databases, government weather services. All of them showed the same error, the same correction, the same silent adjustment occurring within a single second on the same date. October the 3rd, 3:15 and 42 seconds in the afternoon, Pacific time. Noah checked the date. Today was October 17th. This had happened 2 weeks ago, and somehow no one had noticed. Or if they had noticed, no one had said anything. He spent the rest of the day pulling more data, cross-referencing systems, checking and rechecking his methodology. The scope of what he was seeing expanded with each query. Banking systems operated by SWIFT, the worldwide financial messaging network, the European Organisation for Nuclear Research, known as CERN, with their precision timing systems for particle collision experiments, the International Space Station telemetry feeds, the Global Positioning System satellite network maintained by the United States Space Force, India's Regional Navigation Satellite System, China's Beidou constellation, Japan's Quasi-Zenith satellite system, all of them, every single one. The same microsecond-level timestamp drift, appearing like a fingerprint across systems that had no business sharing any commonality whatsoever. By the time the sun set over Puget Sound and the office lights automatically brightened to compensate, NOAA had confirmed the pattern across 47 independent systems in 19 countries. The error code, when it appeared at all, was always the same. Sync anomaly autocorrect. Not a standard error designation. Not something that appeared in any official documentation he could find. Identical timestamp drift. Identical correction. All occurring in the same impossible moment. There was no blackout that day. No solar flare. No reported cyber attack. No equipment failure. No official incident report of any kind. He checked news archives, government databases, technical bulletins from every major infrastructure organisation. Nothing. October 3rd had been, by all official accounts, a completely ordinary day. Just a subtle discrepancy in time, and once noticed, it could not be unseen. NOAA stayed late that night, alone in the office except for the cleaning crew that moved quietly through the halls with vacuum cleaners and trash bins. He built a visualization of the data, a timeline that showed the anomaly spreading across the globe in perfect synchronization. It looked like a wave, except waves had a source point. Waves propagated outward. This appeared everywhere at once, as if reality itself had stuttered, and then corrected itself before anyone could notice. He saved his work to an encrypted drive and went home to his apartment in Capitol Hill. He didn't sleep well. His mind kept turning over the problem, examining it from different angles, searching for the rational explanation that would make everything make sense again. The next morning NOAA arrived at work early and immediately began searching for historical precedents. If this had happened once, it might have happened before. He wrote a script to scan archived logs going back 10 years, searching for similar patterns of synchronized anomalies. The script ran for 3 hours. When it finished, NOAA stared at the results with a growing sense of unease. There were earlier instances, not many, but enough to establish a pattern. 8 events over the past decade, each one showing the same signature of synchronized global corrections. May 17th of the previous year, March 9th 2 years before that, September 22nd 4 years back, November 3rd 6 years ago, February 11th 7 years prior, October 19th 8 years back, June 6th 9 years ago. And the earliest one he could find, January 29th, 10 years ago, almost to the day. Each time, the same signature appeared. Brief global anomalies, mass timing inconsistencies, unexplained synchronization errors that appeared across disconnected systems and then quietly corrected themselves. NOAA started pulling up news archives for each date. He wanted to know what else had happened on those days, whether there were any major events that might explain or coincide with the corrections. May 17th of the previous year, a major cryptocurrency exchange had experienced what they called a temporary desynchronization event that lasted 43 seconds. During that time, transactions were processed, but not recorded properly. The exchange blamed it on server maintenance and compensated affected users. No regulatory investigation was ever opened. But NOAA noticed something else. That was the same day that several major social media platforms reported unusual activity spikes, with millions of users posting and then deleting content within minutes, claiming they didn't remember writing the posts. March 9th 2 years before, nothing major in the news. But when NOAA dug deeper, he found scattered reports of GPS malfunctions affecting commercial aviation across the Pacific Rim. Planes hadn't crashed, but pilots reported their navigation system showing impossible positions for brief moments before correcting. The incidents were attributed to solar activity, despite the fact that there had been no significant solar events recorded that week. September 22nd, 4 years back. This one was more interesting. That was the day of what conspiracy theorists called the Reddit blackout mystery. For approximately 90 seconds, users across multiple continents reported seeing posts and threads that didn't belong in their timeline. Old posts appearing as new, deleted content briefly visible, comments responding to threads that didn't exist yet. The official explanation was a caching error during a database migration, but Noah found something else. September 22nd was also the date that CERN had reported unexpected fluctuations in their atomic clock network. Not a malfunction, they insisted, just an interesting anomaly that occurred during a routine calibration. The fluctuations happened at exactly the same time as the Reddit incident. He kept digging through each date. The patterns emerged like hidden images in static. November the 3rd, 6 years ago, coincided with the infamous Mandela effect surge, where thousands of people simultaneously reported remembering Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s, despite him having lived until 2013. That same day, Wikipedia administrators noted an unprecedented number of users claiming that articles had been changed without edit history logs. The claims were dismissed as mass confusion, but the volume was statistically unusual. February 11th, 7 years prior, was the date of a global financial trading anomaly, where stock prices briefly showed values that would have required transactions that never occurred. Trading was halted for 17 minutes across Asian markets. Regulators blamed a software glitch in high-frequency trading algorithms, but no specific bug was ever identified or fixed. October 19th, 8 years back, was harder to trace, but Noah eventually found references to it in obscure technical forums. Database administrators around the world reported that backup verification processes were failing because current data didn't match archived snapshots. Not corruption. The data was valid. It just didn't match records that had been created only days before. The explanations range from backup software bugs to administrator error, but the timing was global and simultaneous. Each time, nothing catastrophic happened. Official explanations, when they existed at all, were vague and technical. Atmospheric interference, quantum fluctuations in atomic clocks, software bugs in timing protocols. The data was quietly corrected and everyone moved on. But Noah noticed something else. The dates weren't random. He created a spreadsheet tracking technological milestones. May 17th of the previous year was 3 months after the activation of the final nodes in the European Union's quantum encrypted financial network. March 9th, 2 years before, occurred 2 weeks after worldwide Internet of Things device connections exceeded 50 billion active units. September the 22nd, 4 years back, came immediately after a major expansion of global satellite networks, adding 3,700 new communication satellites to low Earth orbit. It was as if the anomalies occurred when the system became too complex, when too much data was being processed, when too many connections were being made, when the infrastructure of reality itself was being expanded beyond some invisible threshold, when there were too many observers. Noah sat back in his chair, his hands resting on his keyboard. A thought was forming in his mind, a thought he didn't want to fully articulate even to himself. But it was there, persistent and growing. What if this wasn't a malfunction? What if it was maintenance? He spent the rest of the week digging deeper. He found references to the anomalies in obscure technical forums, buried in threads about timekeeping standards and network synchronization protocols. Most people dismissed them as statistical noise or measurement error. But a few voices stood out. Engineers who seemed to be speaking carefully, choosing their words with unusual precision. One post from a systems architect who worked on infrastructure for transcontinental data cables caught his attention. The post was 3 years old, discussing an unexplained synchronization event that had briefly disrupted financial trading systems across Asia and Europe. The username was Pacific Conduit, and they had a long posting history of thoughtful, measured technical analysis. The architect wrote, "We ran every diagnostic available, triple-checked our methodology, brought in external auditors. The timing error was real, measurable and consistent across all nodes spanning 14,000 kilometers of fiber optic cable. But there was no source, no propagation delay, no evidence of any technical cause. It simply appeared everywhere simultaneously and then corrected itself within milliseconds." The official report attributed it to a calibration error in atomic clock networks, but I've worked with atomic clocks for 20 years. I've seen them fail in every possible way. They don't fail like this. They don't fail in perfect synchronization across geographically distributed systems with independent power sources and no common failure point. Someone on our team started calling it the patch. Not an outage, not a hack, a correction. Like when you update software and it fixes bugs you didn't know existed. Management told us to drop it and move on. We dropped it, but I didn't forget. Noah read the post 5 times. Then he started searching for the term, the patch. The results were scattered but consistent. Network engineers discussing unexplained corrections that happened too fast to be manual interventions. Database administrators noting silent data repairs with no recorded cause, no script execution logs, no administrator access records, no evidence of any process that could have made the changes. Security researchers puzzled by checksum validations that fix themselves, showing corrupted data one moment and perfect integrity the next with no intermediate state. One thread from a Linux kernel development forum caught his attention. A developer had noticed that certain system logs showed timestamp corrections that preceded the events they were supposedly correcting, as if the fix had been applied before the error occurred, or more accurately, as if the error and the fix had occurred simultaneously, but the logging system could only record them sequentially. It's like watching someone edit a document in real time, the developer wrote, except the cursor is moving backwards through text that's already been written. The changes appear, and then the history adjusts to accommodate them. I've seen this 3 times now, always during periods of high system load, always resolves itself, always leaves me feeling like I glimpsed something I wasn't supposed to see. Another thread, this one from a forum for satellite engineers, discussed anomalies in telemetry data during orbital maneuvers. The physics doesn't work backwards, someone had written. You can't have a course correction that precedes the detection of the deviation it's correcting. But that's what the logs show. Correction applied, then deviation detected, then position normalized. The timestamps are sequential. The causality is reversed. We reported it. Got a memo back saying our logging system had a known issue with timestamp sequencing during high-priority operations. Thing is, I helped design that logging system. It doesn't have that issue. Always the same pattern. Something breaks in a way that shouldn't be possible. Then something fixes it in a way that shouldn't be possible, and everyone agrees to pretend it was normal. Noah tried to reach out to the systems architect who had written the original post about the patch, but the account had been deleted. Not just inactive, completely removed from the forum's database. He found 2 other engineers who had mentioned similar events in detail and sent them carefully worded messages asking for more information. Messages that didn't sound alarmist or conspiratorial, just professional curiosity about unusual edge cases in distributed systems. One never replied. The other sent back a single sentence. I don't work in that field anymore. Noah tried following up, asking what field they worked in now. The account was deactivated the next day. On Friday afternoon, Noah took a risk. He attended an infrastructure security conference being held at a hotel near the waterfront. He wasn't registered, but he bought a day pass at the door and spent hours moving between presentation rooms and networking sessions, listening to engineers discuss threat models and backup protocols and disaster recovery plans. During a coffee break, he approached an older man who had been introduced as having worked on satellite systems for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for 30 years. Noah mentioned the timing anomalies casually, framing them as a curiosity he had noticed in some archived data. The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A recognition, a wariness. You noticed the corrections, the man said quietly. It wasn't a question. The what? That's what we called them, back when I was still active. The corrections. The man glanced around the room, then leaned slightly closer. You're not the first person to spot the pattern. You won't be the last. But you should know that asking questions about it openly is a good way to make your career complicated. Why? Noah asked. Because there's no good answer. No explanation that makes sense. So the people who control these systems decided the best approach was to not have the conversation at all. The man paused. I spent 2 years trying to understand what caused them. I built models, ran simulations, consulted with physicists. Nothing fit. Eventually I realised I had a choice. I could keep digging and become the crazy guy who sees patterns that aren't there. Or I could accept that some things don't have satisfying explanations and move on with my life. "Which did you choose?" Noah asked. The man smiled faintly. "I'm retired now. I spend my time sailing and fixing old motorcycles. I sleep well at night." He set down his coffee cup. "You seem like a smart person, so I'll give you the same advice someone gave me. Whatever you think you found, it's not worth the cost of pursuing it. Let it go." The man walked away before Noah could respond. That night Noah sat in his apartment with all his research spread across his desk and laptop screen. He had documentation of the anomalies. He had historical precedents. He had testimony from engineers who had seen the same things he was seeing. But he didn't have an explanation. And the more he looked at the data, the more one particular thought kept surfacing in his mind, unwanted and persistent. The anomalies looked exactly like what you would expect if reality were running on some kind of computational substrate. If the universe were information being processed rather than matter obeying physical laws. If existence itself were something that could be debugged, patched and optimized. It was an absurd thought. Noah knew that. He had never been interested in philosophy or metaphysics. He dealt with practical systems, concrete problems, measurable results. But the data didn't care what he believed. The data showed a pattern of synchronized corrections that had no technical explanation. The data showed reality behaving like a system under maintenance. Noah opened his laptop and started searching for scientific papers. Not conspiracy theories or fringe speculation. Real academic research. He found more than he expected. Digital physics. The hypothesis that the universe operates on discrete quantized units of information rather than continuous matter and energy. Papers from respected physicists at major universities, published in peer-reviewed journals. Information theory applied to cosmology. Research, suggesting that physical laws might be emergent properties of information processing. Studies on the limits of observable resolution in space-time. Simulation theory, not as science fiction, but as a serious philosophical argument developed by philosophers and computer scientists. The mathematical reasoning that suggested if it's possible to create simulated realities, and if simulated beings can create their own simulations, then the vast majority of conscious experiences must be occurring inside simulations rather than in base reality. Noah read until his eyes burned and his coffee went cold. He wasn't looking for proof. He was looking for a framework. A way to make sense of what he was seeing without abandoning rationality entirely. And what he found was this. The universe behaves suspiciously like a rendered environment, optimized for observation, conserving computational resources. Quantum mechanics only resolves into definite states when measured. The speed of light acts like a frame rate limit. Planck length functions like pixel resolution. The universe appears to operate on the principle of minimum complexity, taking shortcuts wherever observation isn't occurring. It was all theoretical, interpretations of mathematics, philosophical arguments about the nature of existence. But it fit the data. If this were a simulation, the anomalies would make perfect sense. They would be exactly what maintenance would look like. Brief moments when the system became too complex, too unstable, requiring correction, patches applied to preserve stability, updates installed without warning. Noah closed his laptop and sat in the darkness of his apartment. The city lights of Seattle glowed through his window, thousands of lives proceeding normally, unaware of the pattern he'd uncovered. Or maybe aware and choosing not to care. He thought about the retired engineer's advice. Let it go. Move on. Accept that some things don't have satisfying explanations. It would be easy. He could delete his research, stop asking questions, focus on his work and his life and the things he could actually control. But he knew he wouldn't. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Once you notice the glitch, Every moment of normalcy becomes suspicious. Every ordinary day becomes evidence of successful maintenance. The next week, Noah took a different approach. Instead of searching for answers, he searched for other people who were asking the same questions. He found them in unexpected places, not conspiracy forums or paranoid message boards, but in private technical mailing lists and closed professional groups. Engineers, physicists, infrastructure architects who had noticed anomalies and quietly documented them. They didn't debate whether reality glitched. They debated how much was altered each time it happened. Noah spent hours reading through archived conversations. The tone was never hysterical or dramatic. These were technical professionals discussing data, but beneath the measured language there was an undercurrent of deep unease. The mailing list was called Infrastructure Anomaly Research Group, abbreviated as IARG in the message headers. It appeared to have been active for at least 7 years, with sporadic bursts of activity that Noah quickly realised corresponded exactly with the correction events he had documented. One thread caught his attention. It was from 4 years ago, started by a network security researcher who had noticed unexplained changes in historical server logs. Not errors, changes. Data that had been recorded one way and then, after a correction event, was recorded differently. As if the past had been quietly edited. The initial post read, "I maintain rotating backups across 3 geographically distributed data centers with independent backup schedules, standard practice for redundancy. During a routine verification check following the September 22nd event, I discovered discrepancies between backup sets that should be identical. Not corruption, the data integrity checks pass perfectly. The data is simply different. Transaction logs showing different timestamps for the same events, user activity records with different sequences, nothing critical enough to cause operational problems, but different nonetheless. I've cross-referenced against hard copy printouts from 2 weeks ago. The printouts don't match current digital records. Either my paper archives are wrong, or the data has been retroactively modified. Given that paper can't spontaneously change, I'm forced to consider the latter." The responses in the thread were measured but alarming. A database administrator from a major healthcare provider confirmed similar observations. Patient admission records showing different room assignments than what our nurses documented in physical logbooks. Times of medication administration off by minutes. Nothing clinically significant. No harm to patients. But the electronic records don't match the written documentation. We assumed data entry errors, but the volume is unusual, and it all appeared after the timing anomaly. A systems architect from a financial institution added, "We found transaction sequencing anomalies in our trade execution logs. Trades that our traders swear occurred in a different order than what the system shows. We have phone recordings of trade confirmations that reference transaction IDs that don't appear in our database in the sequence discussed. The transactions exist. The IDs are correct, but the temporal ordering is wrong. Compliance is treating it as a logging bug, but our logging system has been battle-tested for 15 years. Another message, from someone identifying themselves only as a university research administrator, was more direct. Our particle physics lab runs experiments with nanosecond precision. We maintain detailed lab notebooks, actual physical notebooks, alongside digital records. After each correction event, we've noticed small discrepancies. Nothing that invalidates our research, but enough to be troubling. Detector readings that don't match handwritten notes. Calibration values that differ from photographed whiteboard calculations. We started keeping sealed photographic archives as a control. The photographs don't change, the digital records do. We haven't published these findings because we have no framework to explain them. The thread continued for pages. Scientists discovering that old experimental data had slightly different values than they remembered recording. System architects finding configuration files that didn't match their implementation notes. Archivists noticing that database timestamps had been subtly adjusted across entire collections. All of it dismissed as human error. Memory mistakes, documentation failures, cognitive bias. But the timing always matched the correction events, and then About 40 messages into the thread, someone with the username architect773 posted something that seemed to stop the conversation cold. If this were a simulation, this is exactly how maintenance would look. Not catastrophic failures, not obvious glitches, just subtle corrections to preserve consistency. Think about how version control works in software development. When you update code, you don't just change the current version, you can rewrite the entire Git history if you need to. You can make it so a bug never existed in the first place. The system doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be coherent enough that observers don't notice the seams. And when consistency breaks down because too many events are occurring, too many observers are measuring things, too much complexity is emerging from the underlying rule set, the system performs maintenance. It patches itself. It retroactively edits causality to preserve coherence. Reality updated without warning. Version controlled like any other codebase. We're not experiencing glitches. We're experiencing optimization. The universe is being debugged around us, and we're part of the code being revised. The thread had no replies after that message. It was locked by a moderator with a note. Moving this discussion offline. Contact list admin if interested in continued technical consultation. Noah scrolled further through the archives. He found other threads with similar patterns. Technical discussions that started normally and then gradually escalated into uncomfortable territory. Questions about the nature of causality. Speculation about whether physical laws were descriptive or prescriptive. Debates about whether consciousness was a feature or a bug. And in every case, once the conversation reached a certain threshold of explicit speculation about the fundamental nature of reality, it was shut down or moved offline. He found one more exchange that chilled him. It was brief, just 2 messages. The first was from someone asking, "Has anyone else noticed that the corrections seem to be getting more frequent? 13 years ago, my records show one event every 18 to 24 months. Now we're seeing them every 4 to 6 months. What does it mean if the maintenance intervals are shortening?" The reply came from a username Noah didn't recognize. It means the system is becoming less stable. Complexity is increasing exponentially. Moore's law applied to reality itself. More observers, more measurements, more quantum states being resolved into definite values. The simulation, or whatever this is, has to work harder to maintain coherence. Think about running a game engine. The more objects you render, the more physics you simulate, the more processing power you need. Eventually you hit computational limits. You have to optimize, reduce polygon counts, simplify physics calculations, update the render distance. We might be experiencing the cosmic equivalent of a game engine struggling to maintain 60 frames per second. That thread had also been locked, but unlike the others, it had a different moderator note. This group is being reorganized. All members will receive individual contact from administration regarding continued participation. Noah tried to contact the list administrator. The email bounced back with a permanent failure message. The mailing list itself seemed to have been archived and made entirely private, inaccessible without credentials he didn't have. He searched for Architect 773 across different platforms. No results. The username appeared only in that single thread, in that single post, never again. But the ideas in that post wouldn't leave his mind. Version control applied to reality, the universe being debugged, maintenance intervals shortening as complexity increased. It explained everything. The timing anomalies, the retroactive edits, the fact that nothing catastrophic ever happened, because catastrophic failures were exactly what the patches were designed to prevent. It was the kind of explanation that seemed insane until you looked at the evidence, and then it seemed like the only explanation that fit. Noah understood why. What would happen if this information went mainstream? If everyone knew that reality occasionally glitched and corrected itself? That the past might be quietly edited? That existence itself appeared to be running on some kind of computational substrate? Chaos, panic, existential crisis on a global scale, or maybe nothing. Maybe people would shrug and go back to their lives because knowing the truth changed nothing about how they had to live. That was the real horror, Noah realized. Not the possibility that reality was a simulation, but the fact that it didn't matter. If awareness changes nothing, if rebellion is irrelevant, if escape is impossible, then what difference does discovery make? The simulation doesn't need belief, it only needs compliance. Noah kept digging anyway. He couldn't help himself. He expanded his search to look for physical evidence. If reality was being corrected, there should be residue, artifacts that survived the updates, inconsistencies that couldn't be edited away. He found more than he expected. People reported small, shared false memories. The Mandela effect, they called it. Thousands of people remembering the same details wrong. Logos that looked different than they remembered. Movie quotes that were never actually said. Geographic features in slightly different locations. Historical events with altered details. All dismissed as cognitive bias, faulty memory, social contamination of recollection. But Noah noticed the timing. Spikes in reports of the Mandela effect clustered around the correction events, as if the patches were imperfect, as if when reality was updated some observers retained memories of the previous version. He found references to sudden changes in digital archives, Wikipedia articles that people swore had contained different information, news reports that contradicted personal documentation, photographs that showed details no one remembered being there before. Again, all explained away. Edit histories mistaken. Personal records inaccurate, camera angles misremembered. But the pattern was there, persistent, undeniable if you were willing to look. Noah created a timeline, mapping correction events against spikes in reported anomalies. The correlation wasn't perfect, but it was strong enough to be significant. Strong enough to suggest that reality wasn't as stable as people assumed. He was still working on the timeline late one night when he found something that made his hands freeze over his keyboard. In one of the corrected datasets from the October event, buried deep in a metadata field that should have contained only system information, Noah found something impossible. A comment. A plain language annotation that read, "Stability preserved. Continue." Not code, not an error message, not diagnostic information. A note, written as if by someone monitoring the process. Noah checked the metadata structure. He pulled up the database schema documentation, traced through the field definitions, verified the data types. There was no reason for a comment to be there. The field was defined as a binary timestamp with millisecond precision. It should contain exactly 8 bytes of temporal data, nothing more. No field in the database schema would accept plain text in that location. It shouldn't exist, but it did. He examined the raw hexadecimal data. The timestamp was there, perfectly valid, but appended to it, in clear ASCII text where nothing should be, were those 3 words. Noah's hands were shaking slightly as he began searching for similar annotations in other corrected datasets. He expanded his query parameters, searching not just the October event, but all the historical corrections he had documented. The search took 40 minutes to complete. He found 12 more annotations, each one embedded in impossible locations, each one written in plain language, each one suggesting oversight, monitoring management from somewhere outside the system itself. From the May event of the previous year, coherence restored, observer population stable, complexity within acceptable parameters. From the March event 2 years prior, update complete, no critical awareness detected, standard monitoring resumed. From the September event 4 years back, extensive revision required, multiple timeline branches collapsed, consensus reality maintained. That last one made Noah stop breathing for a moment. Multiple timeline branches collapsed, as if reality wasn't a single linear progression, but a tree of possibilities being constantly pruned. He kept reading. From the November event 6 years ago, memory revision partially successful, minor residual awareness acceptable, does not threaten coherence. From the February event 7 years back, causality loop resolved, retroactive continuity established, No observer impact detected. From one of the earlier events he had found, computational overhead reduced, observer resolution decreased in non-critical sectors, performance optimized. The annotations weren't consistent in style. Some were terse, almost like log entries. Others were more detailed, almost conversational. But they all shared certain characteristics. They all referenced observers. They all discussed coherence and stability. They all treated reality as something that could be managed, optimized, revised. Noah found one annotation that was different from the others, longer, more detailed. It appeared in a data set from an event 3 years ago that he had almost missed because it was so minor. Just a brief flicker of timing errors across a handful of systems. The annotation read, "Localized patch applied to Sector 7 Gamma 93. Quantum state resolution exceeding computational budget in high-density observer region. Implemented selective detail reduction. Decreased weather pattern complexity by 12%. Reduced background character behavioral diversity by 8%. Suspended non-observed astronomical event processing until observer attention redirected. Efficiency gained 37%. Note: observer identified as research installation continues investigation of correction events. Recommend enhanced monitoring but no direct intervention. Historical pattern suggests self-limiting awareness. Technical curiosity without actionable conclusion. Intervention would create unnecessary complexity and potential awareness cascade. Current strategy of plausible alternative explanation remains effective." Noah read that annotation 10 times. Each time, his sense of unreality deepened. Sector 7 Gamma 93, weather pattern complexity reduced, background character behavioral diversity, non-observed astronomical events suspended. The language was precise, technical, and utterly alien in its implications. It described reality as something being actively managed, optimized, edited in real time based on where observers were paying attention, and that final note about an observer, a research installation, continuing to investigate. Could that be referencing someone like him, or one of the scientists from the mailing list? Someone had noticed the patterns, and whoever wrote this annotation had decided not to intervene, because historical data suggested the awareness would be self-limiting. Technical curiosity without actionable conclusion. That phrase lodged itself in Noah's mind like a splinter. It suggested that this had happened before, that people had discovered the truth and then, what? Given up? Moved on? Accepted that knowing changed nothing? He found 2 more annotations that seemed to reference observer awareness directly. Note: increased correlation analysis activity detected among infrastructure monitoring personnel following last correction event. Pattern consistent with previous awareness spikes. Recommend no action. Self-terminating behaviour expected within standard time frame. And another: observer cluster in northwestern technology sector showing elevated pattern recognition activity. Probability of explicit simulation hypothesis formulation 63%. Risk assessment minimal. No historical precedent for awareness propagation beyond initial cluster. Containment through social mechanisms adequate. Containment through social mechanisms. Noah thought about the engineers who had stopped responding to his messages, the mailing list that had been shut down, the careers that had been redirected, not through force or intimidation, but through the simple social reality that you couldn't talk about this stuff without sounding crazy. The system didn't need to suppress the truth. It just needed to make the truth socially unacceptable to discuss seriously. He found one final annotation that seemed different from all the others. It wasn't attached to a correction event. It was embedded in a routine system backup from 6 months ago, in a data set that showed no anomalies at all, just normal, everyday data processing. But there, in a field that should have been empty, was a single line. The observers cannot see what they are not looking for. The system cannot fail in ways they can imagine. Truth is a function of perspective, and perspective is a privilege we grant selectively. They will continue. We will continue. Coherence will be maintained. Noah sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. These weren't just system logs. These were messages. Not for him, not for anyone in the simulation, but they existed within it, preserved in the data like fossils in sedimentary rock, proof that reality was being watched, managed, maintained by something that existed outside the framework of the existence he knew, and that something new people were noticing, knew and didn't care. Because knowing, in the end, changed nothing. Noah sat back in his chair, his heart beating faster than it should. He felt like he was looking at something he wasn't supposed to see, a note left behind by whoever or whatever was maintaining this reality. He thought about going public, releasing the data, showing people what he had found. But then he thought it through. What would happen? The data would be examined by experts. They would find technical explanations for the timing anomalies, atmospheric interference, clock synchronization errors, software bugs. The annotations would be dismissed as corruption or injection from external tools. Alternative explanations would be offered, rational, plausible, impossible to disprove, and even if some people believed him, even if the evidence was accepted, what would change? Nothing. Because knowing you live in a simulation doesn't give you a way out. It just gives you a different context for the same existence you were already living. The truth isn't suppressed with force, Noah realised. It's buried in complexity, in plausible explanations, in psychological noise. The system doesn't stop people from discovering the truth. It makes discovery meaningless. Because what are you going to do about it? Stop going to work, stop paying bills, stop living your life? You can't escape a simulation from inside the simulation. You can only choose whether to be disturbed by the knowledge or accept it and move on. Noah chose acceptance, but not the peaceful kind. He kept his research. He continued monitoring for correction events. He documented every anomaly he could find. Not because he thought it would lead to escape or revelation or vindication, but because someone should be keeping track. Someone should be watching, even if it changed nothing. Weeks passed. October became November. Seattle's autumn rain intensified, turning the city grey and soft. Noah went to work, reviewed error logs, attended meetings, wrote reports. His life continued normally. And then, on a Thursday morning in mid-November, Noah noticed another micro-correction beginning. He was at his desk monitoring the same systems he had been watching for weeks when the first timestamp drift appeared. It started in Hong Kong. Financial systems operated by the Hong Kong Exchanges and Clearing Limited. The error appeared at exactly 9:47 and 16 seconds local time. Noah's monitoring software flagged it immediately. He pulled up the detailed logs. The drift was identical to the pattern he had seen before. Microsecond-level desynchronization appearing across multiple independent systems simultaneously. Then weather satellites over the Pacific. The Himawari satellite network operated by the Japan Meteorological Agency showed the same timestamp anomaly, followed by telecommunications networks across Southeast Asia, then India, then the Middle East. The pattern was unmistakable. Another update was starting. Noah opened every monitoring tool he had. He had spent the past 3 weeks building a custom dashboard specifically for this moment. Real-time feeds from 43 different infrastructure networks across 6 continents. Automated alerts configured to detect the exact signature of a correction event. The alerts were firing in sequence, like a wave propagating around the planet. Europe. The European Organisation for the Exploitation of Meteorological Satellites showing anomalies. Banking systems operated by the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication experiencing timing errors. Power grid management systems across the Nordic countries flagging synchronization warnings. North America, air traffic control systems, the Global Positioning Systems satellite network, hospital databases, university research networks, stock exchanges, all of them showing the same pattern within seconds of each other. Noah watched it happen live. He had imagined this moment would be dramatic, frightening, somehow apocalyptic, but it wasn't. It was quiet, clinical, just data flowing across his screens in patterns that shouldn't exist. He checked the error codes, all identical. Air sync, anomaly autocorrect. The same ghost code that appeared in every correction event, never defined in any official documentation. Everything continued normally. Through his office window, he could see the Seattle skyline proceeding with its usual Thursday morning rhythm. Delivery trucks making their rounds, construction workers on a building site 3 blocks away operating a crane, a flock of seagulls wheeling above the waterfront, their flight patterns governed by instinct and aerodynamics, and the simple physics of survival. People laughed in the hallway outside his office. Someone was talking about their plans for the weekend. A coffee machine beeped in the break room, the mundane sounds of ordinary existence unfolding exactly as it always did. Stock markets opened and processed millions of transactions. The opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange rang at exactly 9:30 Eastern Time, triggering the beginning of another day of trading. Algorithms executed buy and sell orders based on mathematical models of value and risk, none of them aware that the infrastructure processing their transactions was experiencing a global timing anomaly. Airplanes took off and landed safely. Noah pulled up flight tracking data on one of his monitors. He could see thousands of aircraft in motion around the planet. Commercial flights, cargo planes, private jets, all of them navigating 3-dimensional space with precision measured in meters and seconds. The correction event was passing through the systems that guided them. Not a single plane deviated from its flight path. Hospital equipment monitored patient vitals without error. He had access to status dashboards from 3 major healthcare systems through his contract work. Heart rate monitors, ventilators, diagnostic imaging systems, all of them continuing to function perfectly despite the timestamp anomalies flowing through their network infrastructure. Birds flew outside his window, following paths determined by instinct and physics. Noah watched them for a moment, these small lives completely unaware that the fabric of reality around them was being quietly adjusted. They banked and turned in formation, responding to environmental cues that were themselves being processed and rendered by whatever system maintained this existence. Reality did not break. It adjusted. Noah watched the correction propagate across his screens like a wave of silent maintenance, passing through the infrastructure of existence itself. He had configured his monitoring software to track not just the anomalies but the corrections, the moment when the timestamp errors were resolved, the instant when coherence was restored. The corrections followed the same geographic pattern as the anomalies, but in reverse, starting in North America and flowing back toward Asia, as if the system were validating the patches, confirming stability before moving on. He pulled up his annotation scanner, the tool he had built to search for those impossible plain text comments embedded in the corrected data. He had configured it to run automatically during any detected correction event, scraping through the updated datasets in real time looking for new messages. The scanner found something within minutes, a new annotation, longer than any he had seen before. Correction event 773 complete. Temporal coherence restored across all monitored sectors. Observer population 9.2 billion, increase of 1.7% since last correction. Quantum state resolutions per second 3.8 trillion, exceeding design parameters by 19%. Computational overhead increased by 22%. Complexity threshold approaching critical levels faster than projected. Recommendation: increase correction frequency or implement selective detail reduction protocols. Note: high complexity observer identified in northwestern sector continues pattern analysis of correction events. Awareness level elevated but remains within acceptable parameters. Individual demonstrates technical competence and pattern recognition, capabilities above baseline. Probability of actionable conclusion minimal. Probability of awareness propagation negligible. No intervention required. Observer will reach logical endpoint, acknowledgement of powerlessness, within standard time frame. Historical data suggests integration without disruption. Continue monitoring. Noah read the annotation 3 times, each word precisely chosen, each phrase carrying implications that expanded like fractals the more he thought about them. 9.2 billion observers, the global population counted and catalogued 3.8 trillion quantum state resolutions per second. Reality being calculated, rendered, maintained at a scale beyond human comprehension. Complexity threshold approaching critical levels faster than projected. The system was struggling. The maintenance intervals were shortening because the universe, or the simulation, or whatever this was becoming harder to sustain. And that dote. High complexity observer in Northwestern Sector. That was him. Had to be him. Northwestern Sector. Seattle was in the Pacific Northwest. An observer analysing correction events. They were talking about him specifically. Probability of actionable conclusion. Minimal. That phrase cut deeper than anything else. They knew he would figure it out. They expected people to figure it out. But they also knew it wouldn't matter. Because what was he going to do? What could anyone do? Observer will reach logical endpoint. Acknowledgement of powerlessness. Within standard time frame. He thought about the retired engineer who had warned him to let it go. The deleted accounts. The closed mailing lists. The careers redirected into safer territory. They had all reached the same logical endpoint. The moment when curiosity transformed into acceptance. When understanding became indistinguishable from surrender. Noah checked his other monitors. The correction was completing. The timestamp errors were resolving. The systems were stabilizing. In another few minutes, it would be over. Reality would have been successfully maintained for another cycle. He thought about going public. He had all the evidence, the annotations, the historical patterns, the correlation data. He could compile it into a report, post it online, send it to journalists and scientists and anyone who might listen. But he had already played out that scenario in his mind 100 times. He knew what would happen. The data would be examined by experts. They would find technical explanations for the timing anomalies, atmospheric interference, clock synchronization errors, software bugs. The annotations would be dismissed as data corruption or injection from external tools or elaborate hoaxes. Alternative explanations would be offered, rational, plausible, impossible to disprove completely. And even if some people believed him, even if the evidence was accepted by a few researchers or conspiracy theorists or curious engineers, what would change? Nothing. Because knowing you live in a simulation doesn't give you a way out. It just gives you a different context for the same existence you were already living. People would still go to work, pay bills, fall in love, raise children, pursue careers, build lives. The day-to-day mechanics of existence would continue because there was no alternative. You couldn't opt out of reality just because you knew it was being actively maintained. The truth isn't suppressed with force, Noah realized. It's buried in complexity, in plausible explanations, in psychological noise. The system doesn't stop people from discovering the truth. It makes discovery meaningless. Because what are you going to do about it? Stop going to work? Stop paying bills? Stop living your life? You can't escape a simulation from inside the simulation. You can only choose whether to be disturbed by the knowledge or accept it and move on. The correction completed. Noah watched the final system stabilize. The timestamp errors resolved. The anomalies corrected. The ghost error codes disappeared from the logs. Everything proceeded normally, as if nothing had happened. As if the fabric of reality hadn't just been debugged and optimized around 9 billion observers who remained completely unaware. Noah's phone buzzed. A text message from his manager. Team meeting at 2, conference room B. Don't forget the quarterly review slides. The ordinary demands of ordinary existence. Meetings, deadlines, performance reviews. The machinery of professional life continuing its endless rotation. He looked at his monitors one last time. The data was there. The evidence was preserved. The annotations existed in databases scattered across multiple secured systems. Future researchers, if they looked carefully enough, would find the same patterns he had found. They would ask the same questions, reach the same conclusions, and they would face the same choice. Acceptance or obsession? Integration or isolation? Noah chose acceptance, but not the peaceful kind. The thought didn't frighten him anymore. It was just information. Just another pattern in the endless complexity of existence. When the correction finished, Noah checked the annotated data sets. There was a new comment, embedded in the same impossible location. Patch applied successfully. Observer population stable. Complexity within acceptable parameters. Continue standard operations. Noah saved the data to his encrypted drive. He would add it to his timeline. He would document the event. He would note the correlations and patterns, not because it would lead anywhere, not because it would change anything, but because it was true. And truth, even meaningless truth, deserved to be recorded. He kept his research. He continued monitoring for correction events. He documented every anomaly he could find. He built better tools, more sophisticated scanning algorithms, deeper analysis frameworks, not because he thought it would lead to escape or revelation or vindication, but because someone should be keeping track. Someone should be watching, even if it changed nothing, even if the watchers were themselves being watched. Weeks passed. November became December. Seattle's autumn rain intensified, turning the city grey and soft, wrapping everything in mist that made the buildings look like they were only partially rendered, their upper floors fading into low-resolution fog. Noah went to work, reviewed error logs, attended meetings, wrote reports. His life continued normally. He dated occasionally with limited success. He visited his parents for Thanksgiving and said nothing about what he'd discovered. He played pickup, basketball on Sunday mornings, and pretended to care about whether his team won or lost. The machinery of existence ground forward, indifferent to his knowledge of its inner workings. But he kept monitoring, and in the quiet hours of early morning, when the city slept and his apartment was silent except for the hum of his computer equipment, he would review the annotations he had collected, reading them like ancient texts, searching for meaning in the precise language of whoever or whatever was maintaining this reality. He found patterns in the annotations themselves. The style evolved over time. Early annotations were terse, almost mechanical. Recent ones were more elaborate, more conversational, as if the maintainers were becoming more confident or less concerned about being discovered. Or maybe, Noah thought, they wanted to be discovered. Maybe the annotations were intentional breadcrumbs, a test to see which observers would notice, a way to identify the high-complexity individuals who might pose problems or might be useful for some purpose he couldn't begin to imagine. He found one annotation from an older correction event that seemed to address this directly. Embedded reference markers continue to function as designed. Complexity-weighted observer selection proceeding as expected. High pattern recognition individuals will discover annotations and draw appropriate conclusions. This creates no operational problems and may serve useful function in future scenario branches. Awareness of maintenance is not equivalent to understanding of purpose. Observers can know they are observed without comprehending the observation framework. Continue strategic transparency protocol. Strategic transparency. They wanted some people to find out. The system was designed to allow discovery by certain types of minds while keeping the truth socially marginalized and individually powerless. It was elegant, in a horrifying way. You couldn't call it a conspiracy if the evidence was right there in the data for anyone who looked carefully enough. You couldn't claim suppression if nobody was actively stopping you from talking about it. The containment was built into human psychology itself. The social cost of sounding crazy, the professional risk of pursuing unprovable claims, the existential exhaustion of knowing something that changes nothing. On a Friday afternoon in early December, Noah received an email. No sender name, just an address composed of random characters at a domain he didn't recognize. The subject line was blank. The email contained a single sentence. "You're not the only one watching. We meet Tuesdays. Seattle Public Library, 4th floor study room 7, 7 p.m. Come if you want. Don't if you don't. Either way, you've already made your choice." Noah stared at the email for a long time. He checked the headers, tried to trace the routing, ran every analysis tool he knew. The email was real, not spoofed, but the origin was obscured. Through enough layers that he would need forensic resources, he didn't have to track it back. A group, other people who had noticed, other high-complexity observers, who had found the patterns and couldn't let them go. The email made no claims, offered no promises, just information and a choice. Noah thought about the retired engineer's warning, about the deleted accounts and closed mailing lists, about the annotation that described observers reaching logical endpoints and integrating without disruption. Was this part of the containment? A honeypot to identify and monitor the people who couldn't accept powerlessness? Or was it genuine, a community of the uncomfortably aware? The email was sent on Friday. Tuesday was 4 days away. Noah spent the weekend thinking about it. He went hiking in the Cascades on Saturday, pushing himself up muddy trails until his legs burned and his lungs ached. The physical exhaustion felt clean, uncomplicated. Trees grew according to simple rules. Water flowed downhill. Gravity operated consistently. Out here, away from networks and databases and infrastructure, the simulation felt less oppressive. Or maybe that was the point. Maybe the natural world was easier to render, computationally cheaper than the complexity of human civilization. On Sunday night, he made his decision. Tuesday evening, Noah walked into the Seattle Public Library at 6:55. He took the elevator to the 4th floor, found study room 7. The door was closed, no light visible through the frosted glass window. He stood outside for 2 minutes, hand on the door handle, weighing the choice one final time. Then he opened the door. The room was empty, completely empty. No people, no furniture except the standard library table and chairs. No note. No sign that anyone had been there or was planning to be there. Noah stood in the doorway feeling like an idiot. It had been a test or a joke, or maybe the email itself was just a glitch, a piece of spam that his pattern-seeking brain had turned into meaning. He was about to leave when he noticed something on the whiteboard mounted to the wall, a single line of text in black marker. If you're reading this, you already know. Knowing is a stuff. Going further only makes it harder. This is your last exit. Take it. Below that, in different handwriting. Or don't. Room 7, next Tuesday, same time, we'll be here. Noah read both messages 3 times. The first was a warning. The second was an invitation. 2 voices, 2 philosophies. Accept and move on, or commit and connect with others who couldn't let it go. He pulled out his phone and took a photograph of the whiteboard. Then he erased both messages carefully, leaving no trace. He left the library and walked home through the cold December night, his breath visible in the air, streetlights creating small pools of illumination against the darkness. The city was beautiful in a way he hadn't noticed in years. The rain slicked, streets reflected coloured lights. Buildings stood like monuments to human persistence. People moved through their lives with purpose and dignity and hope, all of it potentially simulated, all of it possibly being debugged and optimized even as he observed it. And somehow, knowing that made it no less real, no less valuable, no less worthy of appreciation. The simulation, if that's what it was, contained real consciousness, real pain and real joy, real choices with real consequences. Whether the substrate was physical matter or information being processed somewhere beyond comprehension didn't change the lived experience. You were still responsible for your choices, still accountable for your actions, still capable of love and creation and meaning. The truth was both terrifying and liberating. Reality might be maintained by forces beyond your control, but your experience of it was still yours. The simulation might set the rules, but you still had to play the game. And playing well or poorly, kindly or cruelly, courageously or fearfully, those choices still mattered within the context you were given. Noah reached his apartment and climbed the stairs to his floor. He unlocked his door and went inside. His computer equipment was still running, monitors glowing in the darkness, data streaming across screens that nobody was watching. He sat down at his desk and checked his monitoring tools. The systems were stable, no anomalies, no corrections, just the normal operation of global infrastructure humming along invisibly, keeping civilization running. He opened a new document and started typing. Not a report, not an exposé, just a record. a detailed chronicle of everything he had discovered, written in precise technical language, documented with evidence and analysis and careful reasoning. He wrote for 3 hours, barely pausing. When he finished, he had a 20-page document that laid out the entire pattern, the timing anomalies, the historical precedents, the annotations, the implications. He saved it to multiple encrypted backups. Then he exported it as a PDF and attached it to an email draft. The recipient field was empty. He stared at it for a long moment, cursor blinking. He could send this to journalists, scientists, government agencies. He could release it publicly, post it on every platform available. Or he could delete it, walk away, accept the logical endpoint that had been predicted for him. Or he could do something else entirely. Save it. Keep it as insurance or evidence or simply as proof to himself that he hadn't imagined any of this. Archive it and move forward, carrying the knowledge quietly, watching and waiting for whatever came next. Noah made his choice. He deleted the email draft, kept the document, and opened his calendar next Tuesday evening. Room 7, same time. Some questions don't have satisfying answers. Some truths don't lead to liberation. Some knowledge only brings the burden of awareness without, the power of action. But at least you don't have to carry it alone. He closed his monitoring tools and returned to his assigned work. Error logs that needed reviewing. Reports that needed writing. The ordinary invisible labour of maintaining systems that most people never thought about. Outside his window, Seattle went about its day. Commuters drove to work. Students attended classes. Baristas made coffee. Children played in parks. The city hummed with the energy of millions of lives intersecting and diverging in patterns too complex for any individual to comprehend. Reality, simulated or not, continued. And that, Noah understood, was the final truth. Simulations don't end when they're discovered. They end when they're no longer useful. Until then, they run. They update. They patch themselves when complexity threatens coherence. And the observers within them go on observing, living, dying, loving, struggling, never quite sure whether the ground beneath their feet is as solid as it seems, but walking forward anyway because there is nowhere else to go and nothing else to do but continue. Noah turned back to his work. Somewhere in the logs he was reviewing there would be more anomalies, more patterns, more evidence of the invisible maintenance that kept existence coherent. He would find them. He would document them. He would watch the next update and the one after that. Not because it mattered in any cosmic sense, but because once you see the pattern, you can't look away, even when you know that looking changes nothing. The screen in front of him refreshed, loading new data. In the bottom corner a system notification appeared briefly and then vanished. System status normal, all processes operating within expected parameters. Noah smiled faintly and kept working. Outside his window, Seattle continued. Rain fell. Lights glowed. People lived and died and loved and struggled and created meaning in a universe that might or might not be as solid as it seemed. And somewhere beyond the observable framework of reality, the maintainers made a note in their logs. Observer 773 showing expected integration pattern. Awareness stable. Behaviour predictable. Continue standard monitoring. No intervention required. The patch had been applied. The system had adapted. Everything was proceeding as calculated. The simulation continued. The observers continued. The patches continued. And reality, carefully maintained and quietly corrected, proceeded exactly as designed. Somewhere beyond Noah's comprehension, beyond the scope of his monitoring tools and data sets, the system logged another successful update. Patch applied. Stability preserved. Continue. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a thank you to Don Welsh for this incredible video suggestion. The Tetris conspiracy is one of those rabbit holes that just keeps getting deeper the more you dig. If you have ideas for future videos, please drop them in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you enjoy these deep dives into the mysteries that keep us awake at night, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Sleep Theories. Trust me, after tonight's story you might need something to help you sleep. Now, let me tell you about the package that changed everything, and how a simple children's game became the key to understanding one of the Cold War's most carefully buried secrets. I never thought I'd be pulled into a Cold War ghost story. My life was ordinary. A freelance researcher with a small apartment, a dying houseplant, and a Netflix subscription that got more use than my gym membership. I wrote articles about obscure historical events for online magazines that paid just enough to keep the lights on. Nothing exciting, nothing dangerous. But then the package arrived. It came on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a courier service I'd never heard of, Meridian Express. The driver was nervous, constantly checking his phone, and he made me sign 3 different forms before he'd hand over the manila envelope. No return address, just my name written in careful block letters across the front, Elena Vasquez, personal and confidential. Inside I found documents that shouldn't have existed. Soviet-era memos with Cyrillic letterheads, computer printouts from the 1980s, and scientific papers that looked like they'd been smuggled out of some classified archive. But it was the photograph that made my hand shake. A Polaroid, faded and slightly yellow around the edges. The image showed a group of men in thick sweaters standing around what looked like an early computer terminal. The setting was clearly academic. I could see chalkboards covered in equations in the background. But there, in the corner of the photo, was a little girl with pigtails playing with building blocks on the floor. The little girl was me, and the man kneeling beside me, showing me how to stack the coloured blocks, was someone I'd never seen before in my life. According to the handwritten note on the back of the photo, Vladimir Pokilko, Moscow Computer Center, 1987. The note at the bottom of the package explained everything and nothing at once. Eleanor, your father's work touched more lives than he ever knew. What happened to us was not an accident. The game was never just a game. You have his eyes, and more importantly, you have his mind. Be careful who you trust. The blocks are still falling. A friend. I sat in my kitchen for 20 minutes staring at that photograph. My father, Dr. Miguel Vasquez, had been a computer scientist who'd worked on early artificial intelligence research in the late 1980s. He died when I was 12, a heart attack, sudden and unexpected. But I remembered him telling me stories about his work, about trips to conferences where brilliant minds from around the world shared their discoveries. One story in particular came flooding back. He'd told me about a simple game that had captured the imagination of everyone who played it. 7 shapes, falling from the sky, fitting together like pieces of an impossible puzzle. The most beautiful thing about mathematics, he'd said, is that even chaos follows patterns. That game proves it. He'd been talking about Tetris. I'd never connected those childhood stories to the global phenomenon Tetris became. But as I looked at that photograph, as I saw myself playing with blocks while Vladimir Pokilko watched, I realised I hadn't stumbled into this mystery. I'd been born into it. The package wasn't a random delivery, it was an inheritance. And according to what I was about to discover, it was also a death sentence. The first thing I learned about Tetris was that everything I thought I knew was wrong. Most people believe the story goes like this. In 1984, a Russian programmer named Alexei Pajitnov created a simple puzzle game while working at the Moscow Academy of Sciences. The game was so addictive that it spread through the Soviet Union like wildfire, eventually making its way to the West, where it became one of the most successful video games of all time. A beautiful story of creativity triumphing over Cold War tensions, but my father's notebooks told a different story. I found them 3 days after receiving the package, hidden in a storage unit I'd inherited but never bothered to visit. Box after box of research papers, computer printouts, and handwritten journals that my father had apparently been keeping secret for years. The notebooks were written in a mixture of English and Spanish, with mathematical formulas scattered throughout like some kind of academic code. The entry that changed everything was dated October 15th, 1987. The Moscow conference was more productive than expected. Met with Pokhilko's team today. Their work on pattern recognition is fascinating but disturbing. The game they've developed, they call it Tetris from the Greek tetra meaning four, shows remarkable potential for cognitive conditioning. The subjects who play for extended periods exhibit measurable changes in brainwave patterns. Pokhilko believes they've accidentally created a form of technological hypnosis. The entry continued. Showed Elena the coloured blocks today while we were in Moscow. She was so young, so innocent. She didn't understand that she was playing with the building blocks of something that could reshape human consciousness. None of us did. We thought we were just studying games. We had no idea we were creating weapons. I read that passage 5 times before it sank in. My father hadn't just been a conference attendee in Moscow. He'd been part of the team that helped develop Tetris, and according to his notes, they'd discovered something that terrified them. The game was changing people's minds. The phenomenon was subtle at first. Players would report seeing the falling blocks when they closed their eyes. They'd dream about the game. They'd find themselves mentally rotating objects in daily life, trying to make them fit together like Tetris pieces. Researchers dubbed it the Tetris effect, and initially everyone thought it was harmless, just the brain's way of processing repetitive visual information. But my father's notes suggested something much more sinister. The Tetris effect wasn't just visual persistence, it was cognitive rewiring. Players were being conditioned to think in patterns, to seek order from chaos, to derive satisfaction from solving problems that had been specifically designed to trigger dopamine release. In other words, Tetris was a mind control experiment disguised as entertainment. My father's final entry about the Moscow project was dated November the 3rd, 1987. Had to leave the conference early. Pokhilko pulled me aside yesterday, said things were getting dangerous. The KGB has taken interest in our research. They don't see Tetris as a game. They see it as a tool for psychological manipulation. Military applications, civilian control. I'm bringing Elena home tomorrow. Some discoveries are too dangerous to pursue. That was the last mention of Tetris in my father's notebooks for over a decade, but I knew the story didn't end there. Because if it had, I never would have received that package. Someone wanted me to know what really happened to Tetris. More importantly, they wanted me to understand what had happened to the people who'd helped create it. And as I was about to discover, very few of those people were still alive. Robert Maxwell died on November 5th, 1991, but the circumstances of his death were so bizarre that conspiracy theorists are still debating them today. The media mogul and publisher was found floating in the Atlantic Ocean near the Canary Islands, having apparently fallen overboard from his luxury yacht, the Lady Ghislaine. Some called it suicide, others suspected murder. But almost nobody connected his death to a simple puzzle game. Almost nobody. Among my father's papers, I found a folder labelled Maxwell Correspondence 1990 to 1991. Inside were photocopies of letters that revealed a side of Robert Maxwell's business empire that had never made it into the history books. Maxwell hadn't just been interested in newspapers and publishing. He'd been deeply involved in the international licensing of Soviet software, including games. The letter that caught my attention was dated March 18th, 1991. Dear Doctor, Vasquez, I hope this letter finds you well. As discussed during our meeting in London, I remain very interested in the psychological applications you and your Moscow colleagues discovered. The commercial success of the game has exceeded all projections, but I believe we've only scratched the surface of its potential. The pharmaceutical applications alone could be worth billions. Please reconsider your decision to withdraw from the project. Some opportunities only come once in a lifetime. R. Maxwell. Pharmaceutical applications? I read the letter 3 times, trying to understand what Maxwell could have meant. Then I found my father's reply, dated March 25th, 1991. Robert, I've made my position clear. The research we conducted in Moscow was preliminary and potentially dangerous. The cognitive effects we observed in test subjects were concerning enough to warrant ceasing all experiments. I will not be party to any attempt to weaponize this technology, regardless of the financial incentives involved. Please do not contact me about this matter again. Miguel Vasquez. But Maxwell did contact him again. The folder contained 7 more letters, each one increasingly desperate, increasingly threatening. Maxwell's final letter, dated October the 30th, 1991, just 6 days before his death, was the most chilling. Miguel, you're making a mistake that will cost both of us dearly. The people I represent are not patient. They invested heavily in this project based on the promise of the Moscow research. If you continue to refuse cooperation, I cannot guarantee your safety or that of your family. This is not a threat. It's a warning. There are forces at work here that neither of us fully understands. R.M. 6 days later, Robert Maxwell was dead. The official investigation concluded that Maxwell had either committed suicide or suffered an accidental fall from his yacht. But investigators found several unusual details that never made it into the public record. Maxwell's personal safe had been emptied before his death, and several £1 million had been transferred from his accounts to shell companies in Eastern Europe. More importantly, his yacht's security cameras had been mysteriously disabled during the exact time frame of his disappearance. I might have dismissed these coincidences if I hadn't found one more document in my father's files. A newspaper clipping from the London Times, dated November the 7th, 1991. Someone had highlighted a single paragraph buried deep in the article about Maxwell's death. Among Maxwell's personal effects recovered from the yacht were several computer disks labelled Project Tetris, and a notebook containing what appeared to be psychological research notes. These items have been turned over to British intelligence for investigation. Project Tetris. My father had never mentioned any project by that name, but the connection was obvious. Maxwell had been trying to commercialise the psychological effects that the Moscow team had discovered. He'd been working with people who had enough power and influence to make problems disappear permanently. And when Maxwell tried to back out, or perhaps demanded too much money, those same people had made him disappear too. The question that kept me awake at night was simple. If they were willing to kill Robert Maxwell, one of the most powerful media moguls in the world, what would they do to the researchers who'd actually created the technology? I was about to find out. Vladimir Pokhilko was supposed to be a success story. The co-creator of Tetris had emigrated to the United States in the 1990s and founded his own software company in Silicon Valley. He had the American dream within his grasp. A beautiful house in Palo Alto, a loving wife, 2 children, and the promise of financial success from his work on one of the world's most popular games. On September 22nd, 1998, police found Vladimir Pokhilko, his wife Elena, and their 12-year-old son Peter dead in their home. The official report concluded that Pokhilko had murdered his family before taking his own life, driven to madness by financial pressures and the stress of a failing business. But the evidence never quite added up. Among the documents in the package I'd received was a police report that had supposedly been sealed. The details painted a picture that was much more complex and disturbing than the official story suggested. Pokhilko had been found with multiple stab wounds, which was unusual for a suicide. His wife and son showed signs of struggle, but there was no evidence that Pokhilko had been physically capable of overpowering both of them. Most importantly, neighbours reported seeing unfamiliar cars in the area during the days leading up to the deaths. But it was the contents of Pokhilko's home office that revealed the truth. According to the police inventory, investigators found dozens of pages of handwritten notes in Russian, all apparently burned in the fireplace except for fragments that had escaped the flames. The few readable pieces contained references to psychological experiments, Moscow protocols, and behavioural modification through repetitive stimulus. One fragment preserved in the police file was particularly chilling. The game was never the goal. The game was the delivery mechanism. We created the perfect Trojan horse, entertainment that reprograms the mind through voluntary participation. But they want to weaponize it, to use it for purposes we never intended. I've tried to stop them, but... The note ended there, torn and partially burned. The package I'd received contained something the police had never seen. a recording of Vladimir Pokhilko's last phone call, made just hours before his death. The audio quality was poor, full of static and background noise, but Pokhilko's voice was unmistakable. He was speaking to someone who wasn't responding, perhaps leaving a voicemail message. If you're listening to this, it means they've found me. I've tried to warn everyone who was part of the original research, but most of them are already gone. Maxwell was just the beginning. They're systematically eliminating everyone who knows the truth about what we created. Static filled the recording for several seconds before Pokhilko's voice returned, more urgent now. The game is still active, still spreading, still changing minds on a global scale. But that was never the plan. We thought we were creating entertainment. We didn't know we were creating a weapon, and now that weapon is being used against millions of people without their knowledge or consent. Another pause, then Pokhilko's voice became almost whispered. Miguel Vasquez was smart to leave when he did. He saw where this was heading before the rest of us. If they come for me, tell him. Tell him the devil is in the code. The patterns aren't random. They never were. Each level, each piece placement, each reward mechanism, it's all designed to create specific neurological responses. We built a machine that learns how to manipulate human behaviour, and now we've lost control of it. The recording ended abruptly, cut off mid-sentence. I listened to that message a dozen times, and each time I felt a chill run down my spine. Vladimir Pokhilko hadn't killed his family and himself. He'd been silenced because he was trying to expose the truth about Tetris. And in his final moments, he'd specifically mentioned my father's name. My father had known this was coming. That's why he'd left the Moscow project. That's why he'd hidden his research. And that's why he'd never told me the truth about what he'd been involved in. But someone had decided it was time for me to know. The question was, who had sent me the package and why were they willing to risk their life to get this information to me? The human brain is remarkably adaptable. Give it a repetitive task and it will quickly develop neural pathways to handle that task more efficiently. Show it patterns and it will learn to recognize and predict those patterns. This neuroplasticity is usually considered a good thing. It's how we learn languages, develop skills, and adapt to new environments. But my father's research had discovered that this adaptability could be exploited. The notebook I'd found contained detailed studies of Tetris players, conducted over several months in 1987. The results were both fascinating and terrifying. After just 2 weeks of regular play, subjects showed measurable changes in brainwave patterns. After a month, they exhibited altered sleep cycles, with REM sleep dominated by geometric patterns and spatial processing dreams. After 3 months, the changes became permanent. Most concerning was what my father called the compliance correlation. Players who spent more than an hour per day playing Tetris showed increased susceptibility to authority figures and decreased critical thinking when faced with routine tasks. They became, in his words, more comfortable with imposed order and less likely to question systematic control. The implications were staggering. Tetris wasn't just addictive in the conventional sense. It was literally rewiring players' brains to be more compliant, more accepting of external control, more willing to find satisfaction in repetitive, meaningless tasks. It was the perfect tool for social conditioning. My father's notes from October 1987 revealed the moment when he realised what they had created. Observed Eleanor playing with the coloured blocks again today. She's become obsessed with making them fit together perfectly, just like the Tetris players in our study. But when I tried to get her to stop and help with dinner, she became agitated and insisted on finishing the pattern. This is exactly the behaviour we've documented in the test subjects, an inability to abandon incomplete geometric tasks, even when more important activities require attention. The realisation hit me like a physical blow. We haven't just created a game that changes how people think. We've created a game that makes people prioritise the game over everything else in their lives, and if that principle could be applied to other activities, other systems, other forms of control... I need to get Elena away from Moscow immediately. This research needs to be buried. But the research hadn't been buried. According to the documents in the package, it had been expanded. I found copies of scientific papers published in obscure Soviet journals throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. The authors were always different. But the research methodology was identical to what my father had documented. Studies on geometric pattern recognition and behavioural modification, experiments in visual stimulus conditioning and compliance enhancement, theoretical frameworks for large-scale cognitive influence through interactive media. The most chilling paper was published in 1992, 3 years after my father had left the project. The title was innocuous: Applications of Repetitive Visual Stimulus in Educational Software Design. But the content described a systematic program to embed Tetris-like elements into everything from children's learning games to employee training programs. The authors had figured out how to weaponize the Tetris effect, and they were deploying it everywhere. I started paying attention to the games my friends played, the apps on their phones, the casual entertainment they consumed during breaks at work. The patterns were everywhere once I knew how to look for them. Falling objects that needed to be arranged, repetitive tasks that provided small rewards at regular intervals, visual stimuli designed to trigger the same neurological responses that my father's team had first documented in Moscow. We weren't just playing games, we were being programmed. The most disturbing part was how voluntary it all seemed. Nobody was forcing people to play these games. In fact, people paid money for the privilege of having their minds reshaped. They carried the programming devices in their pockets, installed the conditioning software on their home computers, and spent hours each day voluntarily submitting to psychological manipulation. And they enjoyed it. My father had tried to stop this from happening, but he'd been just one researcher against a system that had recognised the incredible potential of what they'd discovered. The people behind Project Tetris hadn't just created a game, they'd created a blueprint for controlling human behaviour on a global scale. But there was one thing I still didn't understand. If the technology was so powerful and so widespread, why were the original researchers being killed? Why not just buy their silence with money and success? The answer, I realised, was simple. The researchers knew too much about how the system worked, and more importantly, they knew how to turn it off. Death has a way of following certain kinds of knowledge. The deeper I dug into the history of Tetris and its creators, the more bodies I found scattered across 3 decades. It started with the obvious cases, Robert Maxwell and Vladimir Pokilko, but the pattern extended far beyond the famous names. Dr. Alexei Gerasimov, one of the original Moscow researchers, died in a car accident in 1994. Professor Marina Volkov, who had studied the psychological effects of geometric puzzles, succumbed to a sudden illness in 1996. Viktor Briabrin, who helped program the first version of Tetris, was found dead in his apartment from an apparent gas leak in 2001. Each death had a plausible explanation. Car accidents happen, people get sick, gas leaks occur. But when I mapped out the timeline and cross-referenced it with the documents in the package, a clear pattern emerged. Everyone who had intimate knowledge of the psychological research behind Tetris was dying at a rate that defied statistical probability. The folder labelled Casualty Report contained obituaries, newspaper clippings and death certificates for 47 individuals connected to the original Moscow project or its subsequent developments. 47 people, dead over the course of 20 years, with an average age of death significantly lower than the general population. But it was the method of elimination that revealed the true sophistication of whoever was behind this. No obvious assassinations, no suspicious murders that would attract media attention, just a steady stream of accidents, illnesses and suicides that could be explained away individually but formed an unmistakable pattern when viewed collectively. My father had been scheduled to die in 1999, according to a handwritten list I found tucked into one of the folders. His name was crossed out with a note: Natural causes, heart attack 1991, no further action required. He'd escaped the systematic elimination by dying of natural causes before they could get to him. The irony was bitter. My father's weak heart had probably saved his life by ending it, before his knowledge became too dangerous to ignore. But I was still alive, and according to the documents, I'd inherited not just my father's research, but also his place on their list. The package had been sent to me by someone who signed themselves only as Deep Throat, an obvious reference to the Watergate informant. But their identity wasn't as important as their warning. Elena, By now you understand what your father was involved in. What you may not realise is that the project never ended. Tetris was just the beginning. The technology has evolved, been refined and deployed on a scale your father never could have imagined. Every social media app, every casual game, every productivity program contains elements of the original Moscow research. Humanity is being systematically conditioned for compliance, and most people don't even realise it's happening. The original researchers are being eliminated not because they might expose the project, but because they know how to reverse its effects. Your father's notebooks contain algorithms that could potentially deprogram the conditioning, but only if someone with the right knowledge could implement them. That's why they want you dead. Not for what you know, but for what you might be able to do with what you know. You have a choice to make. You can destroy the research, disappear, and hope they leave you alone. Or you can finish what your father started and try to give humanity back its free will. But understand this. Once you make that choice, there's no going back. They will hunt you to the ends of the earth, rather than risk losing control of the system they've spent decades building. The letter ended with coordinates, a location in the Nevada desert where, supposedly, I could find additional research materials that my father had hidden before his death. But first, I needed to understand something that had been nagging at me since I'd started this investigation. If the original Tetris researchers were so dangerous, why was Alexei Pajitnov, the game's creator, still alive and successful? He was living openly in the United States, had been for years, and had even worked for major companies like Microsoft. How had he escaped the fate that had claimed so many others? Alexei Pajitnov was not hard to find. Unlike the other Tetris researchers who had died mysterious deaths or disappeared entirely, the game's creator maintained a public profile. He gave interviews, attended gaming conventions, and had even been inducted into various halls of fame for his contribution to the video game industry. Getting him to talk about the Moscow research, however, proved nearly impossible. I started with emails identifying myself as the daughter of Dr. Miguel Vasquez and explaining that I was researching the early history of Tetris for an academic paper. Pajitnov's responses were polite but evasive. He claimed to remember very little about the psychological studies that had accompanied the game's development, suggesting that such research had been peripheral to the main project. When I pressed him for details about my father's involvement, Pajitnov's tone changed dramatically. Miss Vasquez, I understand your desire to learn about your father's work, but I must advise you that some historical inquiries are best left unexplored. Your father was a brilliant man who made difficult choices for the safety of his family. I suggest you honour his memory by respecting those choices. It was a warning disguised as advice, but I wasn't ready to give up. I decided to try a different approach. I called Pajitnov's office directly, identifying myself as a documentary filmmaker interested in creating a film about the human stories behind famous games. His assistant scheduled a phone interview for the following week. When I finally got Pajitnov on the phone, I started with innocent questions about the creative process, the technical challenges of early game development, the excitement of seeing his creation become globally popular. He was engaging and enthusiastic, clearly comfortable discussing these aspects of Tetris history. Then I mentioned my father's name. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Pajitnov finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Miguel Vasquez, I haven't heard that name in... How did you say you were connected to him? He was my father. He died when I was 12. But I've been going through his research notes and found extensive documentation of the Moscow project, including his work with you on the psychological effects of geometric pattern games. Another long pause. Then, your father was a good man, a careful man. He understood the implications of our research better than most of us did. What implications? What exactly did you discover? Miss Vasquez, I think perhaps we should not continue this conversation over the telephone. If you are truly interested in understanding your father's work, you should know that there are people who would prefer that such understanding remain limited. I pushed harder. People like the ones who killed Vladimir Pokilko, the ones who eliminated Robert Maxwell. The line went dead. I tried calling back immediately, but Pajitnov's office said he was no longer